there is a concern, I think an awful big concern, that the partisanship has gotten out of hand. No president ever is a dictator or a king.
Breaking their silence, former Trump allies and military leaders speak out against the commander-in-chief's abuse of authority as prominent Republicans publicly disavow the president. Hello and welcome to Inside America with me, Ghida Fakhry. Several top Republicans are breaking party lines and openly vying to back Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden in the November elections. Former President George W. Bush is among those who say they cannot support Trump's bid for a second term. So is Mitt Romney, the only Republican senator who voted to convict Trump after his impeachment by the House of Representatives. And former Secretary of State Colin Powell, in his first public statements about the president, called him a, quote, danger to the United States. Powell, who also served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, criticized Republicans in Congress for not speaking out against what he called Trump's abuses of power, repeated lies, and drifts away from the Constitution.
I certainly cannot in any way support President Trump. I'm very close to Joe Biden on a social matter and on a political matter. I've worked with him for 35, 40 years, and he is now the candidate, and I will be voting for him.
This follows scathing criticism from another retired U.S. general and former Defense Secretary, James Mattis, who labeled Trump a, quote, threat to the U.S. Constitution. With Trump now trailing Biden in the latest national polls, how will this unprecedented wave of public rebukes by the top military brass affect Trump's re-election prospects? Joining me now is former Secretary of the Navy Sean O'Keefe, a Republican who served under George Bush Sr. He's also a former administrator of NASA and currently teaches at Syracuse University. He is one of 89 former defense officials who signed a Washington Post opinion piece saying the military must never be used to violate Americans' constitutional rights. This follows the heavy-handed military approach used by the Trump administration to disperse peaceful protesters outside the White House and the threat to deploy the U.S. military even without the consent of concerned governors. Secretary O'Keefe, just how much of a watershed moment is this blistering attack by the top brass on the president, the commander-in-chief?
Well, I think it's an important statement, and it's not by any means the most unprecedented of circumstances, but it is one that I think is exactly appropriate for the circumstances that we've witnessed over the course of this past week or so. And it speaks volumes that there are several of the most senior military officers who have served in the past in capacities as chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who have made their views very, very strongly known that the use of American armed forces against a citizen of the United States is not something that they would adhere to.
Obviously, one of the former generals who had a long and distinguished career in the military and who made his views very, very clear is Jim Mattis. This is what he wrote in The Atlantic. He said, Donald Trump is the first president in my lifetime who does not try to unite the American people, does not even pretend to try. Instead, he tries to divide us. We are witnessing the consequences of 3 years of this deliberate effort. We're witnessing the consequences of 3 years without mature leadership. We can unite without him, drawing on the strengths inherent in our civil society. You are a Republican. You're a former Secretary of the Navy. Is this a call to rebellion among Republicans, a call to mutiny?
Not necessarily. No, I think this is Jim Mattis, I think, speaking a very thoughtful conscience on this point. I think it's an outstanding commentary on his part. I associate myself completely with his views as well as those of Admiral Mike Mullen, who I think was motivated much the same in his capacity as chairman of the Joint Chiefs previously, as well as Jim Stavridis, who was a naval officer who served during my time as secretary. As a matter of fact, he was a member of my staff. And I very, very much appreciate the fact they have felt necessary to speak in this regard and therefore driven to do much the same.
And do you associate yourself with another former general, Colin Powell, who said that President Trump is a threat to the Constitution, as well as being a danger to the United States, in his words. He went as far as saying that he will support Joe Biden. Is that something that you, as a Republican, are also willing to do?
I really don't see any way that I can really be an advocate of an administration that would even suggest the proposition of using the armed forces of the United States, the active duty armed forces of the United States, against our own citizens.
So if this means voting for a Democrat, you're willing to do that?
To be sure, I've known Senator Joe Biden when he was a senator and then later as vice president, and have a great admiration for the man. I think he is an extremely thoughtful fellow and a guy who I think relates to the diversity of our public in a way that I think is necessary at this time and very different than this administration. I would not be uncomfortable with that at all.
You mentioned the over-militarization of the military, the fact that there were armored personnel, tanks in the streets of Washington, D.C., low-flying helicopters as well, while protesters were out demonstrating, the National Guard, federal officers, unmarked units as well, using tear gas and rubber bullets. And there are also reports now that some members of Congress are asking for an investigation into reports of military-grade drones being used to surveil protesters in Minneapolis and possibly elsewhere. Is that for you another abuse of authority?
I very much so. I just cannot ascribe to that position of it. And there are very rare circumstances in which a governor of a state can call on the National Guard, or the President of the United States could call on the military writ large to actually quell any domestic conflict. And those are incredibly selective in the course of our American history. And they usually are a threat to the republic that would motivate this. That's not what this is. This is a commentary in the streets of all the multiple cities around the nation and indeed around the world that have aligned with the proposition that we really do need to find a more equal consideration, a more equitable consideration of all citizens, regardless of gender, color, race, background, anything else, and assure that we have done so diligently. And I think that's an important statement, and one that's not a threat to the republic at all. If anything, it strengthens us.
But as you know, the president argues that he is trying to maintain law and order. In fact, he's tweeted about law and order quite a few times in the past few days. It's turning into a slogan, it would seem, of his campaign, and it resonates particularly well, typically, with Republicans, who also tend to be tough on law and order. In fact, there have been seven bills in both houses of Congress titled Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement. They never saw a single vote. Will we see a significant shift among Republicans?
I think you're already starting to see a very clear pattern, not only from the opposition, which is the party which is out of power at this time is the Democratic Party, but also several prominent Republicans who are in Congress now and actually articulating their views. Senator Romney, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, all I think have been consistent in that position. It's one I think that's an important feature to continue to observe as we go forward. So I think these are all benefits for real advantage at this juncture of time.
But at the same time, the polls show that a majority of Republicans, in fact 65%, support the police using military equipment and armored vehicles. Law enforcement departments currently own almost $1.7 billion in surplus military gear. In your view, should law enforcement be equipped with this type of sophisticated combat-style equipment to patrol the streets of the United States?
That's far in excess of what I think is necessary to deal with peaceful protests at any time. And in fact, what I believe the circumstances were under which many of the law enforcement units on a state and local level received much of that equipment was post 9/11, in which a group of terrorists attacked New York City, Washington, D.C., and Pennsylvania after a failed attempt of trying to come at Washington again, which absolutely changed the mindset and defensive position on the part of the American people and the public at large to deal with these kinds of questions. That's what provoked that. That's what provoked this enhancement of the armament and capability and law enforcement capacity of state and local officials. And that is not to be equated in any way with, the intent to change the policy to use that capability against peaceful citizens exercising their right to free expression.
Former Secretary of the Navy, Sean O'Keefe, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate it. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, there's mounting pressure on lawmakers to enact new police reform legislation. Top Democrats have introduced a new bill, the Justice in Policing Act of 2020, that would make it easier to prosecute police officers for misconduct and hold them liable for civil rights violations. The proposed legislation would have to pass the Republican-controlled U.S. Senate. It calls for federal funds to be withheld from local police departments that do not enact reforms. This is what the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said after the introduction of the bill.
Today, this moment of national anguish is being transformed into a movement of national action. We cannot settle for anything less than transformative structural change, which is why the Justice in Policing Act will remove barriers to prosecuting police misconduct and covering damages by addressing the quality immunity doctrine.
Joining me now is Andrew Mills, Police Chief of Santa Cruz, California. Chief Mills, thanks so much for joining us. In the past 2 weeks, some police officers and police chiefs, including yourself, have taken a knee and shown solidarity in marching peacefully with protesters demanding accountability and justice. But others have displayed aggressive and sometimes violent behavior toward peaceful protesters. What have the events of the past 2 weeks taught you about what needs to happen for things to change moving forward?
One of the things that many chiefs have come to the realization that this is a tipping point in our nation's history, where people are over it. They want to make sure that all people of color are treated equally and fairly, and this is an opportunity for us to speak out and to do what's right.
You say it's a tipping point, but what makes it a tipping point? Because it seems like we've been here before.
We have been here before, multiple times before. But I think that, normally what you get is a protest in one location or a few locations. This was a worldwide movement. This is irreversible. And I think that many police chiefs, including myself, have come to the realization that we need systemic change, not just shallow change.
And so how will you get that systemic change? How much of it needs to be structural? How much of it needs to have to do with reorganizing police departments? Some calls, as you know, have been focused on defunding police departments. The Minneapolis County has moved towards abolishing the police department altogether. Do you support these calls?
Well, there does need to be structural change and systemic change, and it comes in a few areas. One is the correct policies need to be in place and they need to be enforced, and we need to have oversight to make sure that these policies are followed through. The second thing that needs to take place is there needs to be changes in the law. Many of the things that we do are confined by law here in the United States and in California, and so we need those. That's the structural change that needs to take place. But most importantly, we need to change the heart. Police officers need to recognize that the people are on our side and that we can only police with their consent. Those calling for defunding the police or the abolition of the police, well, that's just not possible. I mean, who's going to handle the car accidents and the shootings and all the other crimes that take place and human trafficking and so forth? There are things that we don't want to do, we never wanted to do, like, for instance, dealing with mental health issues and the homeless. But nobody else has ever stepped up to the plate. The only people that step up to the plate are your police officers, and that's why it's in our court. So if they want to add to our budgets to handle that, then we'll step up once again. But until somebody steps up, we're the only ones available to do it, unfortunately.
But what do you say to those who believe that police departments are overfunded? They're equipped with some of the kind of equipment that you find in battlefields, that there's no need for this over-militarization of the police force, that in fact, if you did defund some police departments, and there are some 18,000 police departments across the country, and actually shifted some of the money towards social programs, that could be more beneficial for the African-American community?
Well, I'm in favor of shifting some of the programs towards the African-American community or all impoverished communities or communities of color. That is not the issue. But, you know, when people talk about the over-militarization of the police, we had an incident here Saturday where a guy was throwing pipe bombs at police officers and shot and killed one of them with an AR-15. We have the only military piece of equipment in the county, which is a armored personnel carrier. And we sent that in to rescue that down to officers, as well as 4 others that were pinned down by gunfire. So people can, float these grand ideas, but the reality on the ground is there are some dangerous people in our nation.
And the reality, Chief Mills, is there's also a lot of police officers who've behaved very aggressively, in fact, even violently towards some peaceful protesters. There have been some serious injuries. You saw the case of the 75-year-old man who was pushed and shoved to the ground, and police officers just walked past him, seeing that he was bleeding from the head. What do you say to those incidents where police officers have not behaved the way you'd expect them?
They have to be disciplined and drummed out of the police departments. There's no negotiation on this. And part of the issue that we need to have that structural change that you talked about is that you need to make sure that the chiefs of police have the opportunity and the ability to weed those people out. It's very difficult at this point to see that kind of change without giving the authority to the police chiefs. Because I guarantee you, if the chiefs don't make the change, they'll be out.
Chief Andy Mills, thank you so much for joining us.
Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum.
This video by 18-year-old Cameron Welch has gone viral on social media platform TikTok, with more than 11 million views in less than a week. Inspired by the renewed debate about racism in the US, Cameron shared the unwritten rules his mother taught him on how to survive as a young black man in America. In a Pew survey conducted last year, 76% of African-American adults say they have been discriminated against because of their race. So what is it like raising African-American boys in the United States today? Imani Perry is a professor of African-American studies at Princeton University. She's also the author of Breathe, A Letter to My Sons. Professor Imani Perry, the other bits of advice that Cameron says he got from his mother were these. He says she told him, don't ride with the music too loud, and if a cop stops you randomly, don't talk back, just compromise. To what extent do your 2 young boys identify with what Cameron has learned from his mom, and to what extent do you, as a mother of 2 African-American boys, identify with the kinds of bits of advice that she gave him?
Well, I mean, it's complicated. I think on one level, certainly, as Cameron's mother gave him, I offer my children advice that's intended to provide them with some measure of security, but I'm also very clear that the behavior of police officers who engage in brutality and killing of unarmed people is not a function of the behavior or choices of African-American people. And that, I want to reiterate that because there's a way in which these conversations immediately pivot to whether the person who has been injured or even killed was somehow responsible for the consequence. And we want to protect our children, but part of the terror of this scenario is that protecting them in many ways feels impossible because we don't have the kind of structure of deterrence or protection that would allow us to do so.
And you say that you talk about race with your 2 young boys. One of them is 14, the other is 16, all the time. Do
Yes.
they see this moment as something different, as a watershed? Do they approach the future with hope or with trepidation? There are many people around America and around the world that think this is something different. The vice president, former vice president himself, Joe Biden, said that this was one of the great inflection points in American history. Do you share those views? Do you see it this way?
I hope it is. I mean, there's always this question with political organizing. What is the relationship between the moment of mass mobilization, which we're in, which is extraordinary in many ways? One, because there are people all over the world who are now invested in this issue. And two, because one of the things that has become completely transparent is how lawless and abusive the behavior of police officers has been in so many of these cities in response to protests. So there is something quite moving and hopeful about this moment, but the question will be, will organizing and sustained action and deliberate choices ultimately lead to the kind of transformations that can be sustained? And that's the organizing work. And my children are aware of that and think about the question of, what's the next step? What will the consequences of this all be?
And as we look at the future and the next steps, it's often easy to forget that the parents and the grandparents of today's young African Americans lived under segregation. This isn't just about police brutality and abuse, is it? This is also about the conditions that are prevalent in African American communities, the huge disparities when you look at the education system, healthcare, housing. Put all of this in context for us.
Sure. I mean, I think it's really important. We can go through every area. We can say, well, look at the wealth gap, for example, which was really a consequence not just of, economic inequality, employment inequality, educational inequality, but actual federal policy that made it impossible for African Americans, by and large, to acquire wealth and the kind of economic foundation that the majority of Americans can rely upon. And then in addition to the kind of historic forms of exclusion, we have a current landscape where the impact of COVID-19 has devastated Black America, both in terms of rates of death but also in terms of employment. So we have this structure of deep inequality that has a day-to-day aspect to it. And then we also have the kind of these moments of terror, which harkens back to the history of lynching. And so what one hopes is that people begin to put together all of the pieces, because in literally every single industry, there is work to be done to address the way in which it has either sustained or driven racial inequality.
And as you say, we've been here before. The crime itself that was perpetrated against George Floyd was outrageous and shocking. But what seems to have really fueled people's anger and galvanized so many people, not just across the United States, but around the world, is the latent racism that still exists among police officers, within police departments, but also within the justice system. I know that you're a scholar of constitutional law. Do you think that in today's day and age, in the era of social media, cases will now have to be prosecuted differently?
I'm not certain about whether there'll be a transformation in how cases are prosecuted, honestly, but I do know that the calls right now for massive defunding of police departments, which are just absolutely, funded at astronomical rates in the United States, and also for decarceration, in particular for nonviolent offenses, which are the vast majority, such that police encounters with Black communities will not be so consistently violent, harassing, feeling like an occupying force as more aggressive and protector. I hope that this organizing will lead to transformations in that relationship. And most Americans who don't live in communities of color don't actually have any conception of what it is like to experience the day-to-day hostile force of policing that really does characterize life as a Black or Latinx person in this country.
Professor Imani Perry, a pleasure to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And so while African Americans hope this is a defining moment in America's racial history, others are more guarded in predicting the lasting impact of the last 2 weeks on the US political system, with its complex, sinuous, and convulsed history. But there have been discernible cracks in an otherwise constant bipolar system, with the commander-in-chief facing dissent among former top lieutenants and political allies who had never dared to cross party lines. What we are seeing today is the culmination of racial and political tensions, which could yet spell the beginnings of a mutiny. Public criticism of a sitting president by retired generals, including your own former Secretary of Defense, cannot go unnoticed, even in these days of stinging public insults and attacks. The images of armored personnel carriers and soldiers, mainly white, in the mainly black US Capitol to repress American citizens protesting against racism have hit a raw nerve. So in short, the president has crossed a red line, and his generals, as he likes to call them, took a rare public and defiant stance. Crossing that red line could cost him dearly even among his supporters, and now that prominent Republicans are openly backing his Democratic challenger in the elections, crossing the finish line will be his hardest obstacle yet. Let us know what you think at _InsideAmerica. But for now, from me and the team, thanks for watching.